中国企业正在加州测试他们的自动汽车，美国政策制定者担忧潜在国家安全风险。中国自动驾驶车对美国国家安全有隐忧。欢迎收看华尔街电视的华尔街焦点。VOA 方斌，中国一些企业正在全球最大的自动驾驶车试验场加州测试他们的自动车。然而，美国政策制定者对这些中国车辆构成的潜在国家安全风险表示担忧。美国交通部长皮特·布蒂吉格最近表示，交通部对在美国市场的中国自动车公司引起的国家安全问题感到担忧。之前，一些国会议员向他发出限制中国自动车公司在美国运营的呼吁。布蒂吉格在接受路透社采访时表示，无论我们谈论硬件还是软件，就像对电信或 TikTok 的担忧一样，对交通技术也存在担忧。布蒂吉格表示，美国需要更好地了解为我们的运输系统提供不同要素的不同企业的真正所有权。他表示，美国政府正在研究与这些中国公司相关的一系列问题，包括他们收集的数据以及如何使用这些数据。4名两党议员7月写信给布蒂吉格和商务部长吉娜·雷蒙多，要求对中国的自动车技术在美国的流行情况以及如何对其进行限制进行调查。自动驾驶车、激光雷达、摄像头、人工智能和其他先进传感器和半导体所使用的技术都可以用来收集有关美国人民和基础设施的数据。这些数据可以分享回中国，并最终分享给中国共产党 CCP。 这些立法者写道。布蒂吉格没有更具体的说明有哪些担忧。美国之音向交通部发出置评请求，要求说明交通部是否采取了后续行动，但是至截稿未获回应。但是从美国媒体对中国自动车技术及其自动车在美国测试的报道中，可以了解美国政策制定者和行政部门对中国自动车引发美国国家安全的担忧所在。中国自动车在美国的突出地位。当涉及到自动驾驶车及其背后的技术时，中国近年来一直走在前列。TechWire Asia 报道，加州机动车部门去年2月17日发布了该州2022年自动车测试报告。该报告显示，中国自动车在美国的突出地位。在26家提交年度报告的自动车公司中，中国占了7家，分别为 Pony AI、小马智行、WellRide、文远之行、Autox、安图、滴滴、Qcraft、青州智行、Apollo、阿波罗、百度、DeepRoot AI、圆融启行、阿里。从测试总里程数来看，在中国公司中领先的小马智行超过28万英里，位居谷歌290万、通用86万、亚马逊54万旗下的自动车公司之后，但领先苹果、福特和大众旗下的美国公司和奔驰、丰田等德日公司。该报告还发现，中国公司正从其自动驾驶车测试中收集大量数据。这些数据可用于多种目的，包括地图绘制、导航和交通管理。然而，它也可以用于监控目的。彭博社7月26日报道说，中国一家制造自动车技术的公司正引起美国同行的担忧。何赛科技激光雷达占 47% 自动车市场份额。位于上海的何赛集团 Hesai Group 是一家自动车激光雷达开发商。激光雷达是一种扫描周围环境并生成3维图像的传感器，是自动驾驶车用于识别障碍物、构建地图和定位车辆场景的关键技术。根据 U Intelligence 的一份报告，何赛集团控制着全球汽车市场 47% 的激光雷达。美国自动驾驶卡车公司科迪亚克 Kodiak Robotics Inc. 使用何赛的激光雷达，甚至美国国防承包商 Inertial Labs Inc. 也选择何赛的产品，用于其基于海洋、陆地和空中的自主系统。从技术角度来看，何赛集团的侧向和后向激光雷达是市场上最好的激光雷达之一，这就是为什么它们是业内使用最广泛的激光雷达传感器之一。科迪亚克创始人兼首席执行官唐·伯内特 Don Burnett 说，总部位于加利福尼亚州圣何塞的激光雷达制造商 Septon Inc. 的产品副总裁布伦诺·莫雷蒂 Brano Moretti 表示，像何赛集团这样的中国竞争对手可以以巨大的折扣出售竞争产品。何赛科技2月初在美国纳斯达克上市，中国科维网称其中国激光雷达第一股，更是为激光雷达行业注入一剂强心剂。该股上市价 23.75 美元，周四8月3日收盘为 11.58 美元。美国由10家相关公司组成的激光雷达联盟发布白皮书，称从中国采购激光雷达的美国公司将承担财务、声誉和法律风险。据该联盟认为，激光雷达技术可以收集大量有关美国基础设施的敏感数据，并可能被中国公司用于军用车辆上，使其自动驾驶。自动车技术成为美中技术冷战最新战线。4名两党议员7月17日给交通部长布蒂吉格和商务部长吉娜·雷蒙多的信 回应了该联盟的担忧。在信中，他们指出，中国政府对在中国运营的外国自动驾驶公司实行严格限制，阻止美国自动驾驶车公司在中国运营或测试。我们担心，如果美国不禁止中国公司在美国开展业务，我们就会放弃严重的战略优势。拜登政府似乎在倾听，彭博社说。在最近接受路透社采访时，交通部长布蒂吉格表示，自动驾驶车技术可能会成为美中正在进行的技术冷战的最新战线。中共小报《环球时报》对这一新闻做出快速反应。7月21日，该报以美国官员以自动驾驶车为打压中国的又一借口，科技遏制反而伤害了美国企业为题，借专家之口指此举表明，美国对中国企业活跃的所有尖端技术领域进行歇斯底里、肆无忌惮的打压。与此同时，美国众议院一个委员会对4家美国风险投资公司对中国人工智能和半导体公司的投资展开调查。美国众议院中国共产党特别委员会本周二致函纪元资本、金沙江创投、华登国际和高通公司 QCOMO 旗下投资部门高通创投，要求提供有关其在中国投资的信息，并为这些公司设定了8月1日的答复截止日期。TechWire Asia 说，中国自己对美国制造的智慧和电动车也十分焦虑。例如，去年早些时候，在共产党高层会议上，北京对特斯拉电动车可以去的地方严加限制，特别是在军事设施周围。而中国自动车公司在美国加州则不受限制，并且仍在充分利用其测试许可。但是该报道说，鉴于对中国间谍活动日益不安，未来几年对在美国的中国自动车公司来说可能会很困难。美国智库信息技术和创新基金会 ITIF 主席罗伯特·阿特金森 Robert Atkinson 告诉美国之音，他不确定中国的自动车对美国国家安全是否造成了损害，但是中国不公平竞争是违反世贸组织规则的。中国人显然能够逃脱惩罚，他们能够采用我们的一些技术，并将其整合到自己的公司中。所以，我认为美国确实存在因中国电动车竞争而失去在美国经济中重要市场份额的风险。谢谢大家收看华尔街电视的华尔街焦点。更多及时的新闻，请看六度世界3w.6度.world。
自动驾驶汽车的维基百科。自动驾驶汽车又称无人驾驶汽车、电脑驾驶车、无人车、机器人车或自驾车，为一种需要驾驶员辅助或者完全不需操控的车辆。作为自动化载具，自动驾驶汽车可以不需要人类操作即能感测其环境及导航。完全的自动驾驶汽车仍未全面商用化，大多数均为原型机及展示系统，部分可靠技术才下放至量产车型，逐渐成为现实。自动驾驶汽车能以雷达、光学雷达、GPS 及电脑视觉等技术感测其环境。2. 先进的控制系统能将感测资料转换成适当的导航道路，以及障碍与相关标志。根据定义，自动驾驶汽车能透过感测输入的资料，更新其地图资讯，让交通工具可以持续追踪其位置。通过多辆自动驾驶车构成的无人车队可以有效减轻交通压力，并因此提高交通系统的运输效率。3. 自动驾驶汽车的展示系统可追溯至1920年代及1930年代间，第一辆能真正自动驾驶的汽车则出现于1980年代。1984年，卡内基美隆大学推动 NovLab 计划与 ALV 计划。1987年，梅赛德斯宾士与德国慕尼黑联邦国防大学共同推行尤里卡普罗米修斯计划。从此以后，许多大型公司与研究机构开始制造可运作的自动驾驶汽车原型。21世纪以后，伴随着资讯科技的进步，更是突飞猛进，全自动驾驶的车辆在试验车辆上已经被制造出来。特斯拉汽车率先推出特定环境下的自动驾驶汽车。
欢迎收看华尔街电视的华尔街评论节目。中国高科技自给自足3个障碍，一个巨大回报。南华早报这篇文章谈到了中国的高科技自给自足计划所面临的3个障碍，以及可能的一个巨大回报。中国希望提高其技术自给自足能力，而美国及其西方盟友则阻止中国企业获取先进的晶片。美国、日本和荷兰禁止向中国出售先进的晶片制造设备。以下是文章的摘要。1. 缺乏投资。对中国国内外高科技投资的限制可能会限制对快速发展高科技制造业至关重要的信息分享。穆迪投资者研究部门在7月中旬表示，有限的中国海外存在将减少中国在全球技术标准中的发言权。 这整个过程可能导致资金不足。实现高产量率的大规模生产将需要重大的时间、人力和资本投资。悉尼科技大学的澳中关系研究所在6月的一项研究中发现，该研究所补充说，这种情况还取决于中国是否拥有必要的设备。2. 与西方盟友相比的知识不足。要提升水平，中国将需要继续获得外国资本、市场和专业知识。美国、日本和荷兰已禁止向中国出售先进的晶片制造设备。即使中国成功创建了一家先进的人工智能芯片设计公司，中国的晶片厂也无法在没有先进的外国设备和化学品的情况下制造晶片。战略与国际研究中心在3月的一项研究中表示，对半导体、机器人技术和航空发动机的发展在很大程度上依赖于进口技术知识和核心技术。穆迪投资者服务表示，而且日本、荷兰和美国的控制构成了重大障碍。3. 中国国营部门的低效率。穆迪投资者服务表示，中国通过国有企业在高科技领域进行投资的决策可能会导致资源错配和过剩的问题。政府已经提供了补贴并开设了投资基金以追求自给自足。但穆迪表示，中国企业可能会对中国的普遍不可预测的政策环境感到恼怒，而私人企业可能会犹豫不决是否进行投资。一个回报，企业将在中国达到自给自足时蓬勃发展。穆迪投资者服务表示，国内供应商数量的增加可以保护国内技术产业免受地缘政治紧张局势的影响，并导致更可持续的经济增长模式。该机构表示，鉴于中国现在进口的晶片价值超过进口石油，减少对进口的依赖将对经济产生显著影响。如果成功实施，自给自足将在中国公司的价值链上创造巨大的市场机会。请大家继续收看《华尔街评论》。法国静悄悄地越来越像个成功的欧洲大国。经济学人的文章指出，尽管给人的印象是骚乱不断，马克龙看着活像个衰神，但是法国在许多方面却静悄悄地比其他欧洲国家做得好得多。今年到目前为止，法国人已经成功把自己的国家说成一个破碎的国家。他们2次通过街头骚乱制造混乱，使国事访问脱轨。第一次是为了拒绝提高退休年龄，强调了人们根本不想正视国家养老金制度的资金问题。第2起是因警察枪杀一名17岁少年，这说明在治安不佳的街区执法不力。马克龙领导的少数派政府似乎正在从一个危机走向另一个危机。然而，在头条新闻全是骚乱的背后，当今法国的一个永恒之谜是，一个厌恶变革、善于反抗、喜欢过度征税的国家，仍然能够做很多正确的事情。最近，法国的表现甚至超过了欧洲其他大国。自2018年以来，法国国内生产总值的累计增长率虽然不高，但却是德国的2倍，并领先于英国、意大利和西班牙。事实上，从某些角度来看，与欧洲4大邻国相比，法国显示出了惊人的活力。部分原因是因为历史原因。法国的高速铁路网于20世纪80年代亮相，不仅使美国的铁路网自惭形秽，也让欧洲邻国的铁路网相形见绌。法国也是欧洲碳排放量最低的国家之一，这并不是得益于可再生能源，而是得益于上世纪70年代启动的核工业。尽管去年法国的56座反应堆需要一定的维修，但法国 66% 的电力仍由核能提供。目前，法国计划建造6个新一代反应堆。按市值计算，法国进入全球100强的公司数量超过任何其他欧洲国家。这主要归功于法国的奢侈品公司，这些巨头在过去10年中的盈利能力和规模都有了飞跃。2022年，法国奢侈品品牌的盈利能力超过了美国科技公司。世界3大顶级奢侈品公司 LVMH、爱马仕和迪奥都是法国企业。不过，除了手工缝制的皮革手拿包，法国企业还有更多亮点。法国还是欧元区最有价值银行法国巴黎银行的所在地。从2017年到2022年，法国在全球武器出口中的份额增加了4个百分点，达到 11%。去年，法国注册的专利数量超过了欧洲主要邻国的平均水平，几乎是英国的2倍。在巴黎南部林木茂密的高原上， 政府正向萨克雷周边的创新集群投入数十亿美元，旨在将其打造成为法国的麻省理工学院。在欧洲排名前100位的独角兽企业及估值超过10亿美元的未上市公司中，英国和德国的数量仍然更多。然而，巴黎的创业企业已经发生了变化。泽维尔、尼尔 Xavier Niel 等曾经的先驱者已经很知名。2019年，马克龙承诺，到2025年，法国将诞生25家科技独角兽企业，去年已经达到这个数字。法国共享单车公司 BlaBlaCar 的负责人弗雷德里克·马泽拉 Frederic Mazzella 说，商学院毕业生过去更喜欢安全的大公司生活，现在成为一名科技创业者变得很酷。Xavier Niel 是一位法国企业家，最著名的是作为互联网和电信提供商 Iliad 的创始人之一。Iliad 是 Free 的母公司， Free 是法国的主要互联网服务提供商之一。Niel 生于1967年，他在通信行业取得了巨大成功，并成为了一位亿万富翁。他是一位极具创新精神的人物，通过引进平价的宽带和移动服务，改变了法国的电信市场。除了他在 Iliad 的工作， Niel 还对教育有着浓厚的兴趣。他共同创立了42，这是一所免费的计算机编程学校，目的是提供更多的机会给那些没有正规教育背景的年轻人。42学校的教育模式非常独特，完全依赖于同伴学习和项目驱动的经验，没有传统的教师和课程设置。此外， Niel 还以投资者身份参与了许多初创公司，并在多个领域寻找创新和增长的机会。他的商业智慧和创业精神使他成为了法国和欧洲科技界的重要人物。如何解释法国这种被人看衰，然而背后却很出色的表现呢？最近的一个因素是国家干预主义在全球范围内的复兴，即使在美国和英国也是如此。在法国，这一传统可以追溯到路易14的财政大臣让·巴蒂斯特·科尔贝尔。第二次世界大战后，政府的中央计划人员又开始计划。现在，欧盟对公共补贴的限制不那么严格了，这让法国可以更自由地放纵自己的核心偏好。以法国北部电池谷正在建设的4座千兆工厂为例，工厂从敦刻尔克港一直延伸到旧矿业盆地的杜夫林和杜埃。一旦全面投产，法国将成为欧洲最大的电动电池生产国之一。在国家的资助下，台湾专题企业辉能科技得以在敦刻尔克建厂。法国工业部长罗兰·莱斯库尔认为，这不仅仅是补贴的问题，而是可靠的低碳能源供应以及加快规划程序和不断发展的电池生态系统的问题。杜夫林的电池生产线将于今年下线，而这距离第一份规划申请的提交仅过去了2年。第二种解释是社会偏好的微调。具有革命意识的法国人喜欢认为他们的社会已经变得极不平等。亿万富翁财富的飙升，通货膨胀对普通人预算的挤压，强化了他们的这种感觉。今年 LVMH 奢侈品帝国的掌门人伯纳德·阿诺特一度成为世界首富，身价高达2110亿美元，在被马斯克超越之前。2022年，欧洲10大富豪中有6位是法国人。马克龙将财富税简化为豪宅税，被诋毁者视为一心想放松劳动保护和削减福利的富豪总统。然而，在马克龙的领导下，法国成功的将对创造财富更宽容的态度与福利国家相结合，在纠正不平等方面仍然比其他大国做得更好。法国的贫困率远低于欧洲邻国的平均水平，仅为美国的1半多一点。幼儿园教育是改善低收入群体生活行之有效的手段，现在3岁以上儿童都可以接受幼儿园义务教育。法国人的平均寿命比美国人长6年，肥胖者也少得多。他们的失业率为 6.9%， 是15年来最低的。尽管马克龙进行了改革，但法国国家税收占国民生产总值的比例仍然高于除丹麦以外的任何经济合作与发展组织成员国，而且用于社会支出的比例更高。最后一个因素是政策的稳定性。马克龙是20年来首位连任的总统。布鲁诺·勒梅尔在第5共和国时期连续担任财政部长的时间最长，这对搭档誓言不加税，并一直在坚持。马克龙邀请外国企业巨头参加1年1度的选择法国会议，这个会议已成为备受追捧的精英盛会。今年 200多家外国企业乘飞机来到凡尔赛宫用餐，共同宣布了另外130亿欧元，约合144亿美元的投资计划。摩根士丹利在巴黎的员工人数几乎翻了一番。辉瑞公司未来4年在巴黎的投资将翻一番，达到12亿欧元。德国安联保险公司 Allianz 首席经济学家路德维克·苏伯兰说，现实情况是，长期趋势是吸引力在提高。法国并非事事顺利，肯定不是这样。公立学校的标准和地区医疗服务的可触及性确实令人担忧。政治依然两极分化，社会焦虑不安。平均实际工资一直持平，而不是像美国那样不断上涨。法国的所有补贴和基础设施项目的价格都令人瞠目。公共财政捉襟见肘，部分原因是为了保护消费者免受生活成本危机的影响，对能源账单设置了上限，但这一做法只是在慢慢取消。自马克龙出生以来，法国从未实现过政府预算平衡。然而，当法国人登上超快列车去享受他们令人羡慕的悠长暑假时，法国模式仍在挑战那些预测其崩溃的人。英国评论家萨姆·鲍曼最近的一份分析报告，对法国在高税收和严格劳动法的情况下仍然相对富裕表示不解。更好的基础设施、更简单的规划和住房供应、更便宜的儿童保育和充足的能源，似乎可以解释这一切。他总结说，法国人犯错多得离谱，但在真正重要的指标上，偏偏表现得这么好。谢谢大家收看华尔街评论节目，敬请订阅。
国是否对巴基斯坦债务问题负有责任 ？VOA。近日，随着中巴经济走廊 China-Pakistan Economic Corridor 建成10周年，巴基斯坦和中国正在大张旗鼓地庆祝经济合作10周年。专家表示，虽然这个大型项目帮助巴基斯坦发展了急需的基础设施，但北京方面不太慷慨的贷款加上伊斯兰堡的管理不善，导致该项目无法扭转巴基斯坦的经济局面。中巴经济走廊于2013年启动，据估计是北京“一带一路”倡议这个全球投资和基础设施工程中规模最大的项目，计划投资超过450亿美元。据两国政府称，随着时间的推移，这一投资额增长至超过620亿美元，其中至少250亿美元投资于巴基斯坦。总部位于伊斯兰堡的非政府机构巴中研究所 Pakistan China Institute 执行主任穆斯塔法·海德·赛义德 Mustafa Haider Sayed 对美国之音表示，该项目是在巴基斯坦的关键时刻进行的。他说，当时我们有很多恐怖主义事件，有很多的动乱，尤其不被视为最佳投资地之一。中国当时就对巴基斯坦产生了信任，立即投入其中，并全力以赴。巴基斯坦政府数据显示，中巴经济走廊迄今已创造20万个就业岗位，修建了1400多公里的高速公路和公路，并为国家电网增加了8000兆瓦的电力。据官员称，该国西南深海港口瓜达尔港是中巴经济走廊的核心，在过去18个月里经手了60万吨货物。本周在伊斯兰堡举行的庆祝中巴经济走廊10周年的活动中，巴基斯坦总理谢赫巴兹·谢里夫 Shahbaz Sharif 称该项目改变了游戏规则。谢里夫对巴基斯坦和中国政要说，这是远见、承诺和友谊的结果。到访的中国副总理何立峰称该项目堪称楷模，他称该项目树立了共同信任、共同发展的典范。何立峰因在倡导经济合作方面的服务突出，获得了巴基斯坦最高民间荣誉。尽管巴基斯坦是中国基础设施和能源投资的最大接受国之一，但伊斯兰堡目前所欠的巨额外债中有近1/3来自北京。研究表明，中国的投资大多处于保密状态，造价并不便宜。美国研究实验室 Data 2021年的一份报告发现，2000年至2017年间，中国在巴基斯坦的大部分发展融资都是贷款，而不是赠款，按商业利率或接近商业利率提供的。总部位于华盛顿的大西洋理事会 Atlantic Council 非常驻高级研究员、巴基斯坦经济学家阿马尔·哈比卜·和 Omar Habib Khan 对美国之音表示， 这种财政负担是巴基斯坦难以通过中巴经济走廊刺激经济的部分原因。很多基础设施的成本相当高，而且很多借款基本上都是以美元计算，而且相当高于市场水平。因此，巴基斯坦继续为其中国债务支付大量美元。因此，我们仍然面临经常账户危机和一些严重的债务问题，他说。2018年，时任总理伊姆兰汉 Imran Khan 的政府抱怨条款不利，开始审查中巴经济走廊项目。然而，在2021年时，政府承诺优先考虑这些项目，以恢复冷却的双边关系。观察人士认为，这种关系源于伊姆兰汉政府对中巴经济走廊条款的不安。经济学家阿马尔·哈比卜汉表示，巴基斯坦肯定有债务问题，但并非是来自中国的债务问题。他指责伊斯兰堡资源管理不善。他说，我们增加了大量的发电能力，但我们没有提高分销渠道的效率，因此无论产生多少电力，很多电力都被浪费了。浪费的电力每年给政府造成数百万美元的损失，而政府对中巴经济走廊建设的发电厂的债务也在不断增加。华盛顿方面称，中国向巴基斯坦和其他一带一路沿线国家提供的发展融资是一个债务陷阱，但伊斯兰堡和北京均否认华盛顿的说法。赛义德表示，通过由中国和巴基斯坦官员组成的联合协调委员会，巴基斯坦在中巴经济走廊项目中有很大的发言权。他说，因此，这种认为中国通过掠夺性融资进入并削弱东道国又获得政治影响力的看法是没有根据的。设在台湾的反虚假信息实验室 DoubleThink 的中国在世界网络去年的一份报告将巴基斯坦列为最受中国影响的国家之一。根据 AData 的报告，中国的贷款条件比起西方国家通常的条件来说，没有那么宽松。阿马尔·哈比卜汉表示，由于缺乏西方对巴基斯坦的资助，伊斯兰堡别无选择。选择很简单，就是是否要建一座发电厂，或者是否要停电12至15小时。所以，是的，中巴经济走廊确实为巴基斯坦提供了工业增长所需的必要基础设施，而西方国家在过去很多年里却无法提供同样的基础设施。根据 AData 的研究，在一带一路倡议下，中国在巴基斯坦的支出是美国的8倍多。美国在巴基斯坦的软基础设施上投入资金，如教育、治理、法律和秩序能力建设，而中国则在巴基斯坦的硬基础设施上投入资金。巴基斯坦是中国在亚洲能源投资的最大接受国，在一带一路运输和仓储项目中所占比例全球最高。中国不仅是巴基斯坦最大的单一债权国，还经常将其从经济崩溃中拯救出来。据巴基斯坦政府称，过去几个月，北京推迟了近80亿美元的债务偿还期限，避免了伊斯兰堡违约。专家表示，为了减轻中巴经济走廊带来的债务负担，巴基斯坦必须找到有效利用通过这些大型项目获得的能源和基础设施的方法，并加强国内的生产和出口。谢谢大家收看。国是否对巴基斯坦债务问题负有责任 ？VOA。近日，随着中巴经济走廊 China-Pakistan Economic Corridor 建成10周年，巴基斯坦和中国正在大张旗鼓地庆祝经济合作10周年。专家表示，虽然这个大型项目帮助巴基斯坦发展了急需的基础设施，但北京方面不太慷慨的贷款加上伊斯兰堡的管理不善，导致该项目无法扭转巴基斯坦的经济局面。中巴经济走廊于2013年启动，据估计是北京“一带一路”倡议这个全球投资和基础设施工程中规模最大的项目，计划投资超过450亿美元。据两国政府称，随着时间的推移，这一投资额增长至超过620亿美元，其中至少250亿美元投资于巴基斯坦。总部位于伊斯兰堡的非政府机构巴中研究所 Pakistan China Institute 执行主任穆斯塔法·海德·赛义德 Mustafa Haider Sayed 对美国之音表示，该项目是在巴基斯坦的关键时刻进行的。 他说，当时我们有很多恐怖主义事件，有很多的动乱，尤其不被视为最佳投资地之一。中国当时就对巴基斯坦产生了信任，立即投入其中，并全力以赴。巴基斯坦政府数据显示，中巴经济走廊迄今已创造20万个就业岗位，修建了1400多公里的高速公路和公路，并为国家电网增加了8000兆瓦的电力。据官员称，该国西南深海港口瓜达尔港是中巴经济走廊的核心，在过去18个月里经手了60万吨货物。本周在伊斯兰堡举行的庆祝中巴经济走廊10周年的活动中，巴基斯坦总理谢赫巴兹·谢里夫 Shahbaz Sharif 称该项目改变了游戏规则。谢里夫对巴基斯坦和中国政要说，这是远见、承诺和友谊的结果。到访的中国副总理何立峰称该项目堪称楷模，他称该项目树立了共同信任、共同发展的典范。何立峰因在倡导经济合作方面的服务突出，获得了巴基斯坦最高民间荣誉。尽管巴基斯坦是中国基础设施和能源投资的最大接受国之一，但伊斯兰堡目前所欠的巨额外债中有近1/3来自北京。研究表明，中国的投资大多处于保密状态，造价并不便宜。美国研究实验室 AidData 2021年的一份报告发现，2000年至2017年间，中国在巴基斯坦的大部分发展融资都是贷款，而不是赠款，按商业利率或接近商业利率提供的。总部位于华盛顿的大西洋理事会 Atlantic Council 非常驻高级研究员、巴基斯坦经济学家阿马尔·哈比卜和 Omar Habib Khan 对美国之音表示，这种财政负担是巴基斯坦难以通过中巴经济走廊刺激经济的部分原因。很多基础设施的成本相当高，而且很多借款基本上都是以美元计算，而且相当高于市场水平。因此，巴基斯坦继续为其中国债务支付大量美元。因此，我们仍然面临经常账户危机和一些严重的债务问题，他说。2018年，时任总理伊姆兰和 Imran Khan 的政府抱怨条款不利，开始审查中巴经济走廊项目。然而，在2021年时，政府承诺优先考虑这些项目，以恢复冷却的双边关系。观察人士认为，这种关系源于伊姆兰和政府对中巴经济走廊条款的不安。经济学家阿马尔·哈比卜汉表示，巴基斯坦肯定有债务问题，但并非是来自中国的债务问题。他指责伊斯兰堡资源管理不善。他说，我们增加了大量的发电能力，但我们没有提高分销渠道的效率，因此无论产生多少电力，很多电力都被浪费了。浪费的电力每年给政府造成数百万美元的损失，而政府对中巴经济走廊建设的发电厂的债务也在不断增加。华盛顿方面称，中国向巴基斯坦和其他“一带一路”沿线国家提供的发展融资是一个债务陷阱，但伊斯兰堡和北京均否认华盛顿的说法。赛义德表示，通过由中国和巴基斯坦官员组成的联合协调委员会，巴基斯坦在中巴经济走廊项目中有很大的发言权。他说，因此，这种认为中国通过掠夺性融资进入并削弱东道国又获得政治影响力的看法是没有根据的。设在台湾的反虚假信息实验室 DoubleThink 的中国在世界网络去年的一份报告将巴基斯坦列为最受中国影响的国家之一。根据 AidData 的报告，中国的贷款条件比起西方国家通常的条件来说，没有那么宽松。阿马尔·哈比卜汉表示，由于缺乏西方对巴基斯坦的资助，伊斯兰堡别无选择。选择很简单，就是是否要建一座发电厂，或者是否要停电12至15小时。所以，是的，中巴经济走廊确实为巴基斯坦提供了工业增长所需的必要基础设施，而西方国家在过去很多年里却无法提供同样的基础设施。根据 AidData 的研究，在“一带一路”倡议下，中国在巴基斯坦的支出是美国的8倍多。美国在巴基斯坦的软基础设施上投入资金，如教育、治理、法律和秩序能力建设， 而中国则在巴基斯坦的硬基础设施上投入资金。巴基斯坦是中国在亚洲能源投资的最大接受国，在“一带一路”运输和仓储项目中所占比例全球最高。中国不仅是巴基斯坦最大的单一债权国，还经常将其从经济崩溃中拯救出来。据巴基斯坦政府称，过去几个月，北京推迟了近80亿美元的债务偿还期限，避免了伊斯兰堡违约。专家表示，为了减轻中巴经济走廊带来的债务负担，巴基斯坦必须找到有效利用通过这些大型项目获得的能源和基础设施的方法，并加强国内的生产和出口。谢谢大家收看。
Do you remember at the beginning of the year, there was so much excitement about China reopening?
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because I think if you go back to last fall, there was all this talk. It's like, why isn't China giving up on COVID zero? When is China going to give up on COVID zero? And they're like, oh, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And then one day it just happened. And everyone's like, okay, here comes China. Here comes all the demand from China. It's on.
That's right. And so a big plank or portion of the bull thesis for 2023 was that because China was reopening its economy after basically being shut for 3 years, you were going to get all this additional economic activity. And while we have seen markets rally, it is definitely not because of China. In fact, China really seems to be struggling here. So we have, Chinese manufacturing is still at or near contraction. I think exports are flagging. Inflation is basically around zero, which might sound great to a number of other countries right now. But of course, it means that in China, growth is subpar.
Yeah, I think the big story for the world too has been oil demand. And there was a lot of expectation that's like, okay, commodity prices are kind of soft, but China's going to reopen, oil demand is going to surge. And that was expected to contribute to further inflationary pressures throughout the world, oil, copper, etc. And so, that totally caught that market by surprise and changed a lot of the sort of macro dynamics globally that people were expecting.
Yep. So now is the perfect time to dig into what is going on with the Chinese economy. And, to some degree, the weakness this year sort of highlights these longer term concerns around China. How is it actually transitioning or developing its economy? Is it going to be able to achieve the ultra high levels of growth that we've seen in the past? Or is it going to fall into something like a middle income trap? What's going on with Chinese local government debt? That's been in the headlines quite a bit recently. And all of that put together has given rise to this idea of Japanification risk for China. So the notion that you might have ultra high levels of debt that weigh on future growth because everyone has to spend their money basically paying down their debt rather than investing in new and exciting things.
Yeah, it's weird because I feel like there's two conflicting themes that I think about with China. So one is exactly as you said, that there is this sort of sluggish growth, overcapacity, indebted cities, and so forth, lack of domestic consumption. And then the other one is this sort of awe that the world has at the booming electric vehicle exports, that they finally got the first flight of their domestic wide-body aviation, that first plane, the Comac, that we talked about with Brad Setzer. And of course, all the anxiety about the chip progress that the country has made, which is why the Biden administration has cut off access to various high-tech, cutting-edge semiconductor equipment. So there's these two things. There's this sort of shock and awe at the success they're having in batteries, cars, and so forth. At the same time, the macro numbers do not look good.
It's true. China is always like a giant waiting in the wings to take over everyone else's economy, and also simultaneously this bundle of vulnerabilities that people are worried is going to tip into a massive financial crisis. That's always the case. But okay, I have to say, we really do have the perfect guest to discuss all of this. We're going to be speaking with Richard Koo, chief economist at the Nomura Research Institute, which is the research arm of Japan's biggest brokerage, Nomura. And of course, he is also the man who basically wrote the book on balance sheet recession. So Richard, thank you so much for coming back on All Thoughts.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Maybe just to begin with, I know you've been talking and writing about this theme of a potential balance sheet recession in China. You also have a book that came out, I think it was just last year, called Pursued Economy, where you talk quite a lot about the trajectory of China's economy. But talk to us about what you're seeing now that suggests there may be signs of a Japan-style balance sheet recession in China.
Well, a lot of Chinese journalists, economists have been contacting me on this issue also, that are we going to be Japan soon? Or are we already on that path? And my answer to that is that, well, there are a lot of similarities between what happened to Japan 30 years ago and what's happening to China today. But there are also important differences. And what the Chinese economists are worried about is that China may be falling to what I call balance sheet recession. And balance sheet recession is triggered by this whole notion that people feel uncomfortable with their balance sheets. Suppose that the debt is too large relative to their assets. And that typically happens after bursting of a bubble. If the bubble is financed with debt and asset prices collapse, but the liabilities remain, people realize that their balance sheet's underwater. And if the balance sheet is underwater, you have to fix it. Well, how do you fix it? You pay down debt. Well, that's the right thing to do at the individual level. But when everybody does this all at the same time, we got into a fallacy of composition problems in that in a national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, you need someone else to borrow and spend those money to keep the economy going. And in a usual economy, if you have too few borrowers, you bring interest rates down. Too many borrowers, you push interest rates higher. And then that's how you keep the economies going. But when the big bubble bursts and asset prices collapse, everyone will be paying down debt. No one will be borrowing money, even at zero interest rates. Because if your balance sheet is underwater, you're not going to borrow money, even if interest rates come down to zero. And that's the prospect that Chinese are worried about. And China got this huge bubble, especially in the residential real estate. And the amount of price increase that China observed on the residential real estate is almost same as what happened to Japan 30 years ago in Tokyo and Osaka. And so when the real estate bubble started collapsing last year, all these Chinese economists began to worry about Japan-like situation where so many people are paying down debt all at the same time, and economy could then fall into a deflationary spiral. I think that is actually already happening in China. A lot of people are saying very few people are borrowing. So many people are paying down debt, even with these low interest rates. And that's a very bad sign macroeconomically. Individually, they might be doing the right things, but collectively, they may be killing the economy. But there's also a big difference between the Chinese situation and the Japanese one, and that is that Chinese are already very much aware of this risk called balance sheet recession. And 30 some years ago, when this thing was happening in Japan, no one in Japan, including myself, had any idea about this balance sheet recession because it was not taught in economic textbooks. I mean, certainly not when I was going through. And so when the economy began to lose its forward momentum, Bank of Japan brought rates down to very low levels. Nothing happens. Structural reform, nothing happens. Fiscal stimulus. Well, fiscal stimulus always worked, but that was cut short because they thought every time the economy showed even the slightest sign of growth, they say, aha, we don't need fiscal stimulus anymore. The economy is improving. And then the economy tanked again. And it tanked again because people were still repairing balance sheets. And when a large bubble bursts and asset prices collapse badly, it's going to take 5-10 years easily to repair those balance sheets. And in the Japanese case, bubble was led by the commercial real estate. The commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Not just in little corner of Tokyo, but the entire country. And so the balance sheet challenge that Japanese companies faced was absolutely massive. They all stopped paying down debt all at the same time. And that's how we got into this very slow growth. But the government did not know how to handle this type of recessions because in economics, we were never taught to look at balance sheets. And so Japanese responses were very inconsistent, I should say. Whereas in the Chinese case, they are fully aware of this recession called balance sheet recession. That's why they have been calling me very frequently these days. I was told, I don't know, I have no way to prove this, but one Chinese professor told me that about half of the PhD dissertations written on economics in China today are based on my work on balance sheet recession. Now, I don't know whether he was just making that number up, but what that suggests to me is that now the Chinese government know that there is this disease called balance sheet recession, and they should know how to handle it also. Because once you know that this is a recession which is produced by lack of borrowers, and the borrowers are not coming in to borrow money because they have balance sheet problems, so the private sector themselves cannot change their behavior. After all, they are doing the right things, trying to repair their balance sheets. Then the government has to come in and borrow and put that money back into the income stream, which means fiscal stimulus is absolutely essential once you're in balance sheet recession. And so my guess is that Chinese government will put in the fiscal stimulus, which they are actually quite good at, and that will keep the recession from turning into a depression or something. So that's the key difference between the Japanese situation 30 years ago and what the Chinese may be faced with today. That they already know what disease they are dealing with, and they are not going to waste any time trying monetary easing or structural reform policies. My guess is that they'll go straight into the fiscal stimulus to keep the economy from losing its power.
So you mentioned that one advantage, perhaps, that China has is having seen the experience of Japan. Incidentally, the U.S. also had that advantage when we had the 2008-2009 financial crisis. You wrote a whole book on it, The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics. Of course, U.S. policymakers didn't exactly listen or heed the warnings of that book, and we had this pretty awful decade for growth. You know, I'm curious, though, just in terms of balance sheets diving in, like, how do you see the distribution of debt in China? So the federal government doesn't have much debt. We know that. How much is it corporates versus real estate developers versus households versus local cities, municipalities? Like, what does the distribution of debt in China look like?
Well, can I first comment on your first comment about the U.S.?
Sure.
Well, when I was trying to explain to my former colleagues at the Federal Reserve that we were suffering from balance sheet recession in Japan and therefore we need fiscal stimulus, not structural reform, and as a former recipient of the doctoral fellowship from the Board of Governors, I have been, going back to the Fed to give seminars on this issue throughout the 90s. And as you mentioned just now, they did not take any of my warnings. I was bashed every step of the way with the Fed economists saying, come on, just Bank of Japan printing the money and everything will be fine. But I would try to explain that doesn't work when there are no borrowers. Well, once 2008 Lehman crisis happened, someone, I don't know who, brought my book to the attention of Chairman Bernanke. And he read it, The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics, the book you mentioned, and he told so many other people in the Federal Reserve to read it as well. And if you notice that at the beginning, he was arguing that, yes, monetary policy can handle it, as he was a disciple of Milton Friedman, who argued that if the Fed acted more responsibly during the Great Depression, things wouldn't have gone so bad. But after reading my book, he started talking about fiscal cliff, which is the opposite of what Friedman was saying. And I thought that was a very important change in the U.S. policy when Chairman Bernanke at various events kept on saying, we cannot afford to fall off the fiscal cliff. The government has to continue borrowing and spending money, meaning that fiscal policy is absolutely essential. And I think that is the key difference between the United States and Europe, because Europe really did not heed any of my advice, especially at the top level. And so they fell into a really serious balance sheet recession, and that recession lasted for almost 10 years. Whereas in the United States, which is the epicenter of this global financial crisis, because of the efforts made by Chairman Bernanke at the Fed and Larry Summers also, who actually endorsed my book, The Holy Grail of Macroeconomics, he talked about the importance of fiscal stimulus. It has to be speedy, substantial, and sustained. So Obama administration was trying to put in fiscal stimulus. They met a lot of resistance from the Republicans. But at least the U.S. was trying to do all the right things. And I think that's why U.S. came out of balance sheet recession much faster than the Europeans. So I would say that my book actually did have an impact on the U.S. policy. If it had impact earlier, it would have probably helped the U.S. economy even sooner. So that's one comment I want to make, and that is that U.S. policymakers realize that they are facing balance sheet recession like a year or two into the recession and made all the appropriate changes to fight it. Now, going back to the Chinese issue of where the debt might be, a lot of people like to talk about the size of the debt. But what is really important is the difference between the size of the debt and the size of the savings. And the fact that the Chinese interest rates, for example, 10-year Chinese government bonds today is offering 2.6%, suggests that savings are far bigger than the debt. Because if the debt or the borrowing is far bigger than the savings, interest rates should be higher, not lower. And the fact that 10-year government bonds is down to 2.6% suggests to me that overall, China's biggest problem is that there's too much savings relative to borrowings. So having said that, who has the capacity to borrow and spend this money? Well, as you correctly mentioned, the federal government or the central government probably has plenty of rooms left to borrow and spend. But the regional governments, I understand, are in very sad shape because they can't sell the land as easily or as expensively as before. And they have used up quite a bit of their resources in the previous years trying to support the economy, and also during the COVID-19. And so the feeling I get is that regional governments are really overburdened already, and probably they will require quite a bit of help from the central government going forward if they are going to be the one who be actually implementing fiscal stimulus, which is needed during the balance sheet recession.
So just on the idea of fiscal stimulus, historically, it does feel like a lot of China's stimulus has come in the shape of support measures to companies or these huge construction projects, big infrastructure and development projects of one sort or another. What would be the ideal form of stimulus this time around? Because, of course, China is trying to balance various needs and goals here. It's talked a lot about retooling its economy away from manufacturing and real estate and more towards consumption. And yet, historically, we haven't seen a lot of fiscal support for households and individuals. It just hasn't been a very big thing in China.
In terms of, fiscal stimulus can come in various forms, right? You can have tax cuts as a form of fiscal policy, or government actually borrowing and spending money, and the spending can go to in very many different places. First of all, tax cuts during balance sheet recession is not going to be very effective. And the reason is quite simple. Those people who get a tax cut will use the money to pay down debt. And that's good at the individual level, perhaps, but collectively, that won't help the GDP from collapsing. And so during balance sheet recession, tax cut should not be the main force of supporting the economy. So the government has to borrow and spend money. So within that, what will be most effective? And I would argue that all those residential housing projects that were started but are now put on hold because the construction companies either have gone bankrupt or having so much financial problems they cannot move forward. I would recommend Chinese government to go in there and help those construction companies so that all the promised construction will be actually completed. I think that would be the most effective way to spend fiscal stimulus, fiscal money. Because that way, those people who were feeling very insecure, I mean, they paid for the apartment house already or put the down payment. Now they're wondering whether they will get anything from all the investments they made. Will at least get the apartments built, and they can, look forward to perhaps a somewhat larger apartments as a result. And the same part will be helping the construction industries. And one key difference between the Japanese and the Chinese situation is that construction is such a large part of Chinese GDP. Construction accounts for something like 26% of Chinese GDP, whereas during the bubble days in Japan, it was only around 20%. And it wasn't a big part of the picture. Whereas in the Chinese bubble, it came with a huge construction boom. And so when asset prices collapse, but construction boom also go bust, then you are hit from both the real side as well as from the balance sheet side. And balance sheet side, there's not much one can do. But on the construction side, if government comes in and help finish those projects that were started, I think that kind of money will probably go a long way in helping the Chinese economy.
Can I ask, what about the role of the foreign sector when we sort of break down the Chinese economy and a sort of sectoral model? So it's like, okay, we know that domestic households have a high level of savings. We know the federal government has not borrowed a lot. But on the other hand, the trade surpluses are massive. And again, I sort of mentioned in the intro that one of the themes right now is that Chinese advanced exports, particularly in areas like batteries and EVs and other cutting edge stuff, is kind of booming. If it continues to boom, can that go some ways in sort of mitigating the need for federal government borrowing?
Absolutely. I mean, if Chinese companies keeps on coming up with new fantastic products, and both Chinese and non-Chinese are willing to borrow money to buy those products, then that will be helping the Chinese economy in massive fashion. And I realize, as you mentioned already, that there are many Chinese companies that are highly innovative, coming up with a lot of interesting products, and they should find plenty of export markets for those products. So that part is definitely there. My concern, however, is the same concern that Japan had back in those days. At that time, 30 years ago, Japan was running the largest trade surpluses in the world. So many people wanted to buy Japanese cameras, Japanese cars, Japanese appliances. And because it was running such a large trade surplus, it could not push it even more. In that, if Japan wanted to export even more by, for example, bringing the Japanese yen down a little bit, Americans would be very upset. The US TR will be knocking on the Japanese and say, no, you better open your market, not sending these additional products to us. And I was actually involved in the US-Japan trade friction back 30 years ago. At that time, the US ambassador to Japan was Mr. Walter Mondale, the former vice president who passed away recently. He found out that this guy, Richard Koo, who is frequently appearing in Japanese television programs, actually carries an American passport. So he asked me to come over, and he basically asked me to represent United States in all these Japanese TV programs on US-Japan trade friction. And at that time, US-Japan trade friction was really, really bad. Serious, ugly, you name it. It was really terrible. So I would go to the U.S. Embassy to get a full briefing from staffers there, and then go to the television studios to try to explain the American position to the Japanese audience. even though I was actually employed by the Japanese Research Institute. And all these other Japanese on the program are waiting with their guns to shoot me down. That was that kind of situation. So I learned a lot about trade friction back in those days. And Japan really could not rely on additional exports because it was already running such a large trade surplus. So if Japan could have used exports by bringing the Japanese yen down a little bit and export its way out, that would have shortened the balance sheet recession by some considerable years. But that option really was not available to Japan at that time because it was such a large trade surplus country. And I think that applies to China today as well. As you know, China, as you mentioned, China is the largest trade surplus country in the world. And if China tries to bring exchange rates down and try to export its way out, I'm sure a lot of countries will be complaining. So there's something the Chinese can do in that export side, especially they're coming up with new products so that other people in the United States, Japan, or Western Europe have no reason to resist because there's no domestic manufacturers for those new products. Still, overall, I don't think it's a good idea for China to rely too much on exports because that could produce backlash called trade friction, which is what Japan faced 30 years ago as well.
Just going back to today, we've been talking a lot about both the parallels and the differences between China's current situation and the one that Japan found itself in a few decades ago, but we haven't yet touched on demographics. And of course, population growth, or the lack of it, is something that is much discussed when it comes to Japan's economy. Is a similar concern going to emerge for China?
Well, I know that's the kind of a standard Washington consensus, if I may, on Japan. But if you look at the actual statistics, Japan's population peaked 2009. What that means is that the bubble burst 1990. So there was 19 years, almost 2 decades, where Japanese population was actually growing. But Japan was still in deflation. In fact, that 20 years, Japan was experiencing the most serious deflation because everyone was paying down debt. And so I would argue that most of the decline that a lot of people refer to population, one can use that on perhaps the recent 10 years, but certainly not the first 20 years after the bursting of the bubble. The first 20 years came almost exclusively from balance sheet problems, not from population problems. Having said that, then you look at the Chinese situation, and we notice that Chinese population starts shrinking, this year or last year. That's the same year the bubble burst. So Japan had 19 years before the population starts shrinking. In the Chinese case, the bursting of the bubble and the decline of the population are happening on the same year. And that is likely to make Chinese policy response that much more challenging.
You mentioned that one constructive thing that the federal government in China or the central government could do is just make sure the apartments get built, that people have all this uncertainty because they put down payments on apartments. They're waiting for that. The developers are then hobbled, and that creates all kinds of stagnation. Suppose that happens. Is there something further that's next? Because presumably China doesn't want to just go back to the old model where construction is 25 or 26% of GDP, or presumably that wouldn't be your prescription to just go back. So let's say that somehow they were able to clean up the mess at the developers and removed some of that overhang. Is there some structural move that should be then done further, whether it's direct support to households, something with the safety net, et cetera, that the government should then undertake to sort of continue on these reforms and not fall back into a debt trap?
Well, I'm actually concerned about the fact that Chinese companies stopped borrowing money long before the bubble burst. When you look at the Chinese flow funds data, and if you look at the corporate sector, they stopped borrowing money around 2016. Well, up to 2016, they were borrowing quite a bit of, 2015, they were borrowing quite a bit of money. So household sector was saving money, corporate sector was borrowing money, and that's how economies are supposed to move forward. But starting 2016, the corporate borrowing starts shrinking quite substantially. And that was, in my view, the most disturbing development in the Chinese economy that we should pay great attention to. And that is because, as you mentioned earlier, Chinese companies are coming up with all these new products, great products on electric vehicles, batteries, and other areas. They should be borrowing money at this stage of Chinese economic development. Just like, United States in the 50s and the 60s, or Japan in the 70s, when they had lots of competitive advantage, great new products, those companies should be borrowing money, not saving money. But for some reason, Chinese companies start reducing their borrowings starting 2016. So they were like in the balance sheet recession long before the bubble burst. And I really want to find out what is the cause of this Chinese non-borrowing before the bubble burst. After the bubble burst, you can explain everything on balance sheets. But with the borrowings are shrinking before that, you cannot use balance sheet argument to say why these companies are not borrowing money. And if the reason why these companies are not borrowing money is due to this renewed trade issues with the United States, then it's a much more serious problem for the Chinese economy, because the trade friction and the possible decoupling with the outside world, decoupling with the Western world, means Chinese companies will be losing some of their best customers and the richest customers, because the Western nations have far higher per capita GDP than the rest. So if the decoupling happens, all these companies will lose their export markets, or they cannot rely on export market as much as they were able to do before. And if that's the reason companies were not borrowing money, then Chinese economic problem has a much deeper problems to resolve. And as a result of these companies not borrowing money, but the household sector still saving money, Chinese government actually had to borrow money and spend it to keep the Chinese economy going for 5-6 years before the bubble burst. And that borrowings, mostly done by the regional governments, is putting regional governments in very difficult position now, because they have basically used up quite a bit of their borrowing power already before the balance sheet recession is starting. And there, I think they will have to come up with a lot of new financing techniques to make sure that these regional governments can continue to borrow and do whatever the fiscal stimulus that is needed to fight the balance sheet recession. But until we find out why Chinese companies stop borrowing money around starting 2016, it's very difficult to predict where the Chinese economy is going, because if Chinese companies reduce their borrowings starting 2016 because of decoupling fears with the West or regulatory uncertainties, because Chinese government have been putting in all sorts of regulatory shocks to the IT industry, to the education industry, financial industry, and of course the real estate industry. If those are the reasons why Chinese companies start holding back their investments and borrowings, then even after balance sheet problems are resolved, those problems will be still with us. And that will be a huge drag on the Chinese economy going forward.
This was going to be my next question, actually, which is, I think in 2015, we had some supply side reforms from China, but then in later years, we had various crackdowns on things like the technology sector, on property developers, some parts of the education system. Very famously, when it came to real estate, we had the 3 red lines missive and things like that. Are there signs, in your opinion, that this type of regulatory uncertainty is making companies more nervous about perhaps ramping up their borrowing or their investment?
Well, it's very difficult to ask that directly because you know how it is in China. People are not free to say things these days. But talking to lot of people, I get the sense that those are the concerns that many companies have. And on top of it, China is in the middle of what economists would call middle income trap. Middle income trap is if you are the lowest cost producer, all the companies will be moving factories to China because you can produce things at the lowest cost in China. But once your wages start increasing and other places like Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh start offering even more attractive places to produce products, then these factories will start moving abroad. And China is in the middle of the middle income trap. It's a per capita GDP of about 120,000 US. At that point, they should be very careful to encourage more companies to come in and stay invested in China. But those regulatory interventions from the Chinese government is doing the opposite of what Chinese government should be doing. So if you add that on top of all the other things, that China is already in the middle income trap, per capita GDP 12,000, that's when these things become very important. That may be one of the key reasons why companies are not investing in China.
I just want to ask I just have one last question from my perspective, and I actually would love to just shift at the end here to your perspective on the U.S. And, if the U.S. in 2009 was a bit slow out of the gate with the fiscal response, it certainly was not slow in 2020, in 2021, persistent fiscal support in 2022 and 2023 with some of the public investment acts, et cetera. How much would you attribute, say, the above-trend inflation in the U.S. to the fiscal support? And do you see some sort of fiscal cutbacks as necessary in order to get inflation back to target, or can monetary policy and just sort of stabilization and normalization get the job done?
Wow. So we are moving to the U.S., right? If I may. I think what happened to the United States, of course, at the beginning, during the pandemic, people kind of allowed inventories to fall because they never knew when people will come back to their stores again. And then once they realized that COVID-19 problem is behind us, I don't know whether it's actually behind us because I'm seeing quite a few people getting sick recently, even in Taiwan. And so I don't know whether we are really behind this thing. But suddenly everybody started ordering for more goods to replenish their inventories. But here, of course, you get into a fallacy of composition problems again, right? If you're the only one doing it, it's not a big deal. But when everybody does it all at the same time, then there will be bottlenecks everywhere. And I think that's how the whole thing started. This inflation talk started. But what else that happened is that, United States lost, 22 million jobs during the pandemic, the first part of the pandemic. When that many people lose jobs all at the same time, these workers cannot afford to stay in the same city waiting to find jobs in the same industry any longer. Many of them had to find jobs that will pay them in any industry, in any geographical location. But when people start moving all over the place to look for jobs, their expertise, know-how, skills will be lost because they're not going back to the same jobs. And I think that really effectively moved labor supply curve to the left. That is to say, if you want to get the same people with the same set of skills, you just have to pay more because there's so few of them left in your neighborhood. And if you look at countries where unemployment skyrocketed, like United States and Canada, wages have also gone up quite sharply this time around. Whereas when you look at Japan, where companies try to hold on to their workers as long as they can, and so unemployment rate in Japan only went up to 3.4%. That was the worst. And that was just for a month or two, and then start coming down again. Most of the workers are still with the company. All the skills are still available. So when the demand picked up again, the kind of labor shortage that United States and Canada faced were not seen in Japan. And as a result, wage increases are much lower than US or Canada. And so a lot depends on what kind of labor market you had. In the case of our United States, because of this rather sharp leftward shift of labor supply curve, U.S. ended up having wages going up sharply higher, and that's adding to the inflation that we are talking about now. Whereas those countries where workers stayed with the companies, wages are moving up much more slowly. So we have to make adjustments for these key differences between the countries, I think.
You know, I have just one more question, which is, when we last had you on the podcast, I think it was something like May 2020, and a lot of these decisions about how to respond to the pandemic were just being made at that time. And I think the headline of our podcast was something like Richard Koo on why the recovery will be difficult. So looking back now, was there anything that surprised you about the speed or shape of the recovery in the US or the Western world?
Well, actually, the vaccines were developed much faster than anyone had right to expect. You know, typically these things takes 5 to 10 years before it's fully approved. But this time around, they were approved much sooner. And people, of course, came out with these highly innovative vaccines that no one thought of before. So that was a big surprise from the medical side. And the government also putting, as mentioned earlier, these massive monetary and fiscal help to the people so that they really didn't have to deplete their savings, as it were. I thought recovery would be slow because one of the reasons I thought recovery would be slow is because I thought a lot of people would be depleting their savings during these lockdowns. And so once the economy begins to normalize, I thought these people will be rebuilding their savings. But if they are rebuilding their replenish their savings to the previous level or possibly go even higher, that would be like another balance sheet recession in that so many people will be replenishing their savings. And as a result, there will be excess savings in the private sector. And that will slow the economic recovery. That was one of the thoughts that I had back in those days. But instead, the government supplied quite a bit of support to these households. And we end up talking about excess savings in the household sector that can propel the economy further. That was not in my mind when we last spoke, in May of 2020. So those are the surprises that I was not anticipating at the time. But then you turn this thing around. In the Chinese case, Chinese government really did not give as generously as the American government or the European governments to these people who were suffering under lockdowns. And as a result, the sense I get is that a lot of Chinese households and Chinese companies, small and medium-sized companies, they had to really draw down their savings to weather these lockdowns. And if those Chinese companies felt that they don't have enough savings to weather the future rainy days, and they would like to increase their savings to make sure that they have enough ammunition to fight the next round, then we may end up having something like balance sheet recession. But this time, it's on the asset side of the balance sheet, not on the liability side of the balance sheet. But the effect would be the same. If all these Chinese households and companies try to rebuild their savings all at the same time, then Chinese economy would be that much more weaker. It's very difficult to get any data on something like this from the Chinese side, but my sense is that this could be a bigger problem in China than in the United States or in Europe.
Well, Richard, you brought us back full circle to China, so thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming back on Odd Lots. A delight.